Hi, welcome to the Soil Restoration course. My name is Sandra Tushinska and we will be looking at the course overview today, an introduction to soil formation and composition. So I think probably the best thing to do now is to just introduce myself a little bit and tell you a little bit about myself in terms of who the person is that's teaching this course. And I'll give you a bit of a background that's relevant to the course specifically. And that is my agricultural science degree that I attained from Sydney Uni. It was a 4-year degree and it ended up with an honours project. And I chose microbiology as my major because I was interested in how microbes specifically can remediate a lot of the side effects of agriculture, like pesticides and antibiotics and things like that, that really didn't sit well with me, that these things are part of our food production systems. So basically, I looked at the biodegradation of herbicide diuron from the cotton field soil, which is quite toxic. It runs off into waterways from the cotton industry and ends up killing the grasses that dugongs feed on in the estuaries and in the ocean. So all these herbicides obviously have flow-on effects. So that's really of interest to me and how to remediate these things. Then I followed on with a PhD project, which was looking at the effects of heavy metals on cells of root symbiotic or ectomycorrhizal fungi at the University of New South Wales. And so that was a 4-year project, which was really interesting, just looking at the actual cellular mechanisms of the interaction between heavy metals and these fungal cells. And then I did a postdoc at Rutgers University in New Jersey in the US, looking at phosphate and carbohydrate acquisition by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, as well as heavy metal absorption by ectomycorrhizal fungi. So a bit of everything was thrown into that project there. And I sort of followed on with more being interested in the education side of things. I wrote a book at that time, and also later on was just looking for ways of interacting with the community about these subjects of soil. I was a journalist for the Good Organic Gardening magazine, and I worked with kids in schools as the garden angel, and I gained a diploma in education during that time. So I sort of just was looking at how to get out of academia and learn, first of all, how to make this sort of topic more available to the community rather than just being thrown around in academic circles. So eventually I got a job as an environmental projects officer at Woodfordia Inc., where the Woodford Folk Festival site is, and that's really opened up sort of my eyes to this whole idea of science communication, because I was able to present to larger audiences these concepts that I was really interested in, like fungi and how they communicate with plants and what's happening underground, and all of this stuff sort of came together during this 6-year engagement there. And I've run community education and citizen science projects. Particularly the mycology research project was of interest because I was really getting people interested in working with fungi, and that's really kind of where this whole thing led me to, in the end, to do Dr. Elaine Ingham's course at the Soil Food Web School. She's kind of the pioneer, in a way you can say, that has taken the idea of soil food web out of academia and brought it into the public in the US, and is running this huge school where you can learn a lot about this sort of stuff. And I sort of thought, well, we need something Australian as well. And I have a very different way of communicating this sort of science. So I thought, well, it'd be so great to create something for our own context here and also bring in more of the scientific background into this. And this is where this course was born. The course is really meant to have 10 lessons, but really I'm going to split it up. Each one of them is big enough to split up. But basically today we're just going to cover the course overview and the introduction to soil formation and composition. And then I'm going to record another one to discuss soil destruction and where our soils in Australia sit in terms of how we use the land. We'll then go into lesson 2, which is about soil ecology and the soil food web. So how does soil ecology actually work? What are the interactions between the organisms in the soil, and how do they all function together to produce plant growth? Really, that's what it's all about. How the plants and the microbes that the plant decides to have around itself to help it grow, how does that look? What does it mean? And how does this translate into ecological succession? Then we'll go into the different parts of the soil food web, and that's the bacteria, first of all, because they're the primary little creatures that gain nutrition for the plant, and how they function in not only plant nutrition and immunity, but also soil function, like how do they build soil structure, which is really, really fascinating. So we'll go in depth into bacteria and the different ones that promote plant growth. We'll then look at the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, because they are the ones that have come on land with plants, and how they take on a huge role of feeding the plant and the plant immunity and decisions that are made as to who's going to collaborate in the whole ecological process around the plant with the plant to make, once again, the host plant grow the best it possibly can. So these are really ancient forms of fungi that we'll talk about, and they are the ones that are symbiotic on the roots of plants. Then the second group we'll discuss will be the ectomycorrhizal fungi, and they're more present in arboreal forests. They're very much to do with eucalypt forests as well in Australia, and how these incredible fungi actually network entire forests and the entire ecosystem. And then, of course, how does that fit into with the decomposer fungi, which need to then deal with the debris that falls down? So we'll talk about the saprotrophic fungi as well. And then we'll look at the actual organisms that are required to get the minerals out of bacteria and fungi to actually feed the plant, because that's the whole crux of it. How these primary nutrient gainers, the bacteria and the fungi, are actually then predated upon or grazed by other organisms. So the first organisms we'll talk about that are predatory or the grazers are the protozoa, and how this relates to nutrient cycling and plant available nutrients being present for the plant, and what role this actually plays in the whole ecology of the soil system. And the second group are multicellular organisms, animals pretty much. Protozoa are just one cell big, and you can see some protozoa examples here. So unicellular organisms. And then we'll look at the nematodes, these little guys here, and how they actually relate to nutrient cycling by consuming fungi as well as bacteria and each other, depending on the size and where they fit into the scheme of things, and how that relates to nutrient cycling and ecology in the soil as well. And then a very interesting topic, which is pertinent, I think, to really discuss, is the carbon sequestration into soil. How do we remove carbon from the atmosphere on a mass scale to bring more balance into the greenhouse gas issue, and how to actually start looking at climate change from a perspective of soil, and how fungi in particular are very, very much the guys that do the work. And these are just hyphae or cells of fungi. Here you can see in both these images, and how these guys are really the carbon bearers in the soil. And of course, other things play a part as well, and we'll concentrate on the fungi, but I'll describe many other ways this happens as well. And then finally, we'll talk about how to cultivate these microbial processes, how to get the microbial biodiversity with specific focus on fungi, because they're the ones that are mostly missing from our soils because of everything that's happened, particularly in agriculture. They're really sensitive to disturbance, and how do we get them back into our soils, and how do we work with them rather than against them? And of course, in this cultivation process focus, we'll look at thermal composting. That's going to be in lesson 9, and then vermicomposting in lesson 10. And then we'll give examples of how application of these composts actually, how they affect soil and the plants that we're trying to grow. And then lastly, there's a discussion which everyone's invited to in terms of Q&A and practical application of putting everything together, and how can we do this? How do we apply what we've learned to the soil? How do we restore it? How do we regenerate soils knowing now what we know? So that's it for the course overview. And now we're going to launch into what is the point of all this. Why do we want to have this brought up, and why do we want to study this and learn it and understand it so we can apply it? Well, it turns out that soil is the thin layer covering the planet that stands between us and starvation. I actually don't know who really said this, but in this article here that you can read for yourself, Soil Degradation, Will Humankind Ever Learn? They have this quote, and they reference it with various people saying this one sentence. And the fact that agriculture covers 38% of Earth's land mass, that means that we have a huge potential to actually change. By changing the way we manage soils, we can change the way we coexist with soil and the plants and the biodiversity that soil provides. So that's of very big importance, I think, and we're losing 24 billion tonnes of topsoil per year. That's 3.4 million tonnes per person per year. That's huge amounts of loss of this thin layer that stands between us and starvation. So it potentially, and it should, and probably to some extent maybe still does, contain about 2,500 gigatons of carbon. And so that's where carbon should be, is in the soil. And so soil has 3 times carbon that of the atmosphere and 4 times that of plants and animals. And of course, these are just figures that may or may not be true in terms of whether that should be in the soil and already is, or whether we've already, since that has been claimed, released a heap more into the atmosphere. So this carbon issue is huge. Carbon is our friend and we need it. Obviously, we breathe it out and plants breathe it in. So we just need more plants. We just need vegetation to cover the earth and do what it always has done with its microbial cohort, and that's to keep everything in balance. 2/3 of Australian agricultural land is degraded by soil erosion, salinity, acidity, and contamination. So that's of very big significance in our context. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of the course and the background to it, as well as what's ahead of us in terms of the structure and the topics we're going to cover. So the first lesson really is going to be about soil formation. We will look at how soil is formed from bedrock material. What are the processes involved in that? Then we'll look at soil texture, the sand, silt, and clay that is formed as a result of various processes that crumble that bedrock. And then we'll look at the minerals as plant nutrients and their availability in soils worldwide, as well as how to think about these nutrients in terms of mineral content in soils. And then finally, we'll cover soil definition and what it is before moving on to lesson 1.2. Okay, so you'll be hearing from me in lesson 1.1. See you then.